Pacer Nation, what's going on? Welcome back to another episode here of your go-to Pacers podcast, setting the pace, and we've got Caitlin Cooper back on the show, Basketball She Wrote. Make sure you guys subscribe and join the Patreon there. Caitlin, thanks so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Hey, thanks for having me back. We all joked headed like, am I still going to know how to podcast with you guys? It's been a while since
It,
our schedules have aligned.
it's been way too long. I think the last time we actually had a conversation was at the last Eastern Conference Finals games. Caitlin, me and you were there watching that game in the media section, so that was a lot of fun to see the Pacers in the Eastern Conference Finals, but obviously did not advance past that round. But let's get things started off here. Obviously, Tyrese Haliburton, the guy that was with Team USA, they just won a gold medal, taking down France in Paris. I know Tyrese didn't play. A lot's been talked about with Tyrese not getting a lot of playing time there, but today we found out from Brian Windhorst that Team USA did not announce it, but he had a little bit of a leg injury, and we know that he was battling with a hamstring injury all season long after he went down in January against the Celtics. So, is that a little bit of a cause for concern with you at all going into next season?
I mean, I guess it would depend on what exactly the state of the injury was. I mean, given that
Yeah.
they were having him go out there and play some minutes, I'm not overly concerned by it because if he felt good enough to go out there when the games were somewhat out of hand, you'd think that he's probably going to be okay for training camp.
Yeah, it's interesting because they didn't specify if it was the hamstring or not. And if it was, you're talking about now a potentially lingering hamstring injury for 6, 7, 8 months now. It feels like a long time. But I really hope it's kind of an unrelated injury. But as it relates back to the Team USA experience, what do you feel that Tyrese can really take away from that experience to make him a better player for this upcoming regular season?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I wrote after the first game when they played Canada in the exhibition that when he was out there in that second grouping before Derek White got added to the roster, and it was, Tatum and Bam and Anthony Davis and Anthony Edwards, it was like, oh, this is what Tyrese's defense could look like when he's surrounded by two wing size wings and these two mobile rim protectors, and they can switch things. And you could notice a play where his self awareness was pretty good, where he communicated and scrammed himself out of mismatches twice. And I wrote about the possession in part two because Tatum made a rotation that the Celtics would have asked of him to make in the NBA Finals, which it was a rotation the Pacers would never ask Tyrese Haliburton to make. So the fact that Tatum made it, which isn't what Team USA really wanted him to do in that situation, was like, hey, this is also somewhat foretelling for the Pacers defense in the sake that Pascal Siakam hasn't had a full training camp and he hasn't fully gotten acclimated to exactly the ways that the Pacers play defense yet either. So if this is happening to Jason Tatum with Team USA, it's realistic that, there could also be improvement from Pascal. So I took a few things away from that, maybe extrapolated too much from one possession in an exhibition game. But other than that, I think it kind of relates to what Rick Carlisle talked about too, and that just Tyrese getting to be around 11 of the other best players in the world and seeing the way that they prepare their bodies, the conditioning aspect of it. I know he mentioned, LeBron and what his longevity has been in the league. And for Tyrese to take that away, one of the biggest things for Tyrese to be able to do next season, in addition to him making incremental improvements defensively, is that he be able to play, right? It's everything that you guys just mentioned, talking about the leg injury. So his availability is a big one. And I think the more that you can be around those types of players and soak up any knowledge you can, it's always to your benefit. In addition to just being in the pipeline of Team USA and potentially putting himself in contention to be on the roster again when it's in LA in 2028.
I mean, he's 24 years old. He's the face of the franchise, getting supermax money. I mean, there's a lot on his plate right now, but I think he's very well equipped to handle all of that. But what are the next steps for him as he kind of continues to ascend into the player that hopefully he can become?
I think it's all defensively, honestly. I mean, I think it's all defensively for this entire roster. That was my main takeaway from the Eastern Conference Finals. In that the Pacers offense held up. It even held up against the Celtics up until, somewhat sometimes in the second half of those games late in the fourth quarter. But the main difference between them was that Boston had a defensive foundation they could rely on, and the Pacers didn't necessarily. They didn't have the defensive versatility they needed to necessarily put around Tyrese if he doesn't take some of those incremental steps forward. So it's about watching what he can do. I think predominantly from a strength perspective. I think that's the area that we're still most looking from him. I don't think he's always in the wrong place, specifically as an off-ball defender. And he did show some improvement. I know it didn't show up. Like, for instance, you guys probably remember Game 5 against the Knicks in the Eastern Conference semifinals. He got put into action on 22 picks by the Knicks. The Pacers are still keeping him in show and recover. he had some pretty loud mistakes in the first half doing that, getting split, overcommitting himself. In the second half, he was much better at holding the line. The greater impact was that he himself only used like 15 picks. That there was a draining effect of having him show that many times in a single game and how much he was involved offensively at the other end. But he did get better physicality wise, stepping up above the level. And like I said, holding the line, sometimes even taking a slide step and redirecting the ball a little bit there. You want to see more of that from him if that's the type of coverage they're probably going to keep, or if he does get on a mismatch, what can he do in the post to better hold his ground in some of those situations? And then if his defender does end up being the pick and roll ball handler, which typically the Pacers try to avoid as much as they can, but his ability to take a bump as a skinnier player and not just get knocked off that route, a lot of it just comes back to the strength aspect, which we were talking about at this time last year too, but I really think that's what it boils down to.
As great of a player that Tyrese is, it feels like there is kind of a lot of naysayers now, like people who are saying, "Oh, I don't know if he should have been on Team USA," or "Oh, he wasn't the same player in the second half of the year." He clearly hears all of this, and he's talked about how good he was in the first half of the year. That some people might think it's a fluke. Now this is a Tyrese Haliburton who experienced winning in the regular season or in the playoffs, however you want to call it, going to the conference finals. He now won a gold medal. Do you feel that now this is a player that is accustomed to winning, that is going to take nothing less, that we have to win and take that step forward now that he's been able to experience it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. And I think, too, some of the stuff about talking about him as a fluke, we heard a lot about injuries that the other teams were suffering and going throughout the playoffs. There was not a lot of talk about, Warrior Tyrese and the fact that he was still dealing with lingering effects from the hamstring, that he was listed on the injury report with back soreness multiple games in a row, wearing the back contraption device. You could see the effects of that still in the playoffs, I felt, until right at the end of that Knicks series and when they got back to Boston. And the signs were there that he was doing things that looked more like Tyrese. And that was really kind of the first time we were seeing him and Pascal playing in peak form at the same time. And it happened for 2 games?
Yeah.
You could see the impacts of it. I was tracing it after he got back from the hamstring injury. He wasn't taking his sidestep to the right threes near as much. He didn't want to power off that left leg. He didn't get the same amount of separation. And as much as people don't want to hear about it, and it is water under the bridge in this sense, but it was kind of like, a hurricane followed by a tsunami, and that once Buddy was no longer on the roster, the predominant way for somebody who's struggling to get that separation because they can't power off their left leg was using Buddy as a ghost screener to ghost those switches, and they didn't really have that movement shooter anymore. The movement shooter became Tyrese. Tyrese was playing that role for everybody else, and he was getting his threes in a different way than what he was at the beginning of the season in some respects. That's not all of it. And I think in the playoffs, he did show growth in that role. Andrew Nembhard certainly showed growth as a pick and roll ball handler in ways that you think that they could be, even more compatible than what they already looked. But the reality of it is he was dealing with an injury. I think that was pretty evident to you guys, to most of the Pacer fans, and I'm sure that watched every game of him last season. And I think that if he is healthy, he can get back to what he was doing at the beginning of the part of the year, because I never really bought into that. There was those tweets on the internet comparing it to Linsanity, which I didn't really like, because I don't think we need to disparage Jeremy Lin, but also Tyrese was an all-star last year.
Yeah.
He's been doing this for a while now. It wasn't just a tiny blip on the radar. So some of the criticisms I understand. Do I think he needs to assert himself in certain situations and that sometimes the read needs to be for him? Sure. But also, if we look at the in-season tournament game against the Lakers, when the blitzing first started really affecting him, and the Lakers are uniquely positioned to be a good blitz team in the way that other teams aren't. If you look at the numbers, when Tyrese passes out of a blitz, the Pacers' production per chance on that is elite level. So if Tyrese is passing out of shots and you're still getting really good offense out of those traps, I don't think it's necessarily a negative thing. So I think sometimes it's a little bit over the top, I'll say.
You brought up Andrew Nembhard, and I think this is a great point to transition now, because I think the biggest question mark of the offseason was, will the Pacers reach an extension with Andrew Nembhard? They get him locked up for a 3-year, $59 million extension. Do you feel like he's a long-term fit at shooting guard next to Tyrese Haliburton?
Yes. I was even more bullish on that after what we saw in the playoffs for the reasons that I just mentioned. That if Tyrese is getting face guarded by Deuce McBride 94 feet. You need to have another person out there that can initiate and run offense. Andrew Nembhard did that. Just to give people the numbers, points per chance in the playoffs, the best pick and roll ball handler for the Pacers was Andrew Nembhard, 1.047 points per chance for Nembhard compared to 0.988 for Tyrese and 0.983 for TJ. Now, context needs to be added to that. That does not mean that Andrew Nembhard has usurped Tyrese as a creator, because Andrew was more often being defended by the weaker assignment, right? He was guarded by Dame. He was guarded by Jalen Brunson. But the point being is when Tyrese needed somebody to run offense against those weaker assignments, they had a very good option for doing that. In addition to what he does defensively, even if Tyrese makes some strides defensively because of everything he brings with his offensive impact, I still don't think you're going to want him defending at the point of attack. And Andrew is their best point of attack defender on the roster, with Ben Sheppard also being pretty close in that regard. So those are the two major things that I think apply to being compatible with Tyrese and really supporting the things that he's going to need. So, yeah, I mean, I can't predict whether Andrew's going to continue shooting 50% on catch and shoot threes, but you can see some refinement in his shooting mechanics. You saw some of different ways he was getting to threes with Team Canada and his games at the Olympics as well. So I'm pretty bullish on that overall, because even if you look back at Tyrese's relationship with De'Aaron Fox with the Kings, it was never offensively why that didn't work. That's not the reason that they were getting outscored in those minutes. It had to do with the defense and the unwieldy roster for the Kings, and Andrew provides a lot more defensive solutions than what was the case in the context with Sacramento. So I think that it can be pretty good for the Pacers long term, considering what steps Andrew's already taken.
And when you talk about those steps, I'm excited for what's next. And it's nice to know there's going to be quite a few extra years tacked onto that deal. What were your thoughts on the Andrew Nembhard extension? When he didn't sign it on day one of being eligible, I feared it might not happen. Did you love the move? Did you like the move? What were your thoughts on the Pacers getting ahead of it, making it a priority, and right when they could, being able to offer that extension up?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really big win for the front office. And we're seeing this trend a little bit from players this summer, including with Jalen Brunson, right? That players are looking like they want to be taking more guaranteed money right now rather than potentially chancing free agency. So I don't exactly know what all of Andrew's motivations were for signing the contract that he signed in the way that he did. But I pointed this out in the article that I wrote, and I pointed it out on Twitter, that this is the first time the Pacers have signed somebody to a second contract that they've drafted since Miles Turner, and then Edmund Sumner also signed 2 contracts. But like literally everyone else that they've drafted, they've yet to sign to an extension. So this is a pretty big deal for them, that they've hit on a draft pick and that they want to retain him and that he's fit as well as he has. And that, he, along with Ben Sheppard, were both 2 examples for the Pacers throughout the playoffs of being, we can accomplish winning and we can accomplish development at the same time. They were a rare intersection of that.
I want to go back to last season a little bit, because it was Nembhard was going to become the backup point guard and McConnell was going to be out of the rotation.
Right.
But then all of a sudden, you mentioned Buddy Hield, Bruce Brown, they get traded. They need to fill that role there at the shooting guard, and it's Nembhard that does it. But why do you think he didn't really have the same impact off the bench as he did as a starter?
I think it was mostly because, and I can't say this for sure, but the kidney stone thing, I think, was a little bit bigger deal headed into preseason maybe than what everybody knew. And then he gets into the middle portion of the season and he also has the hyperextended knee. He's dealing with a bad back. I'm thinking that probably affected his off-day training, because you could see it with his ball handling. Like certain things that he would do with his throw-ahead dribble, certain hand tricks that he used using his inside hand to make himself more dynamic, but coming off of handoffs, he wasn't necessarily doing those things anymore. And his shot obviously made a big deal for him in the playoffs to take that along, but he just didn't always look like he was moving entirely correctly. And then TJ just brings a different, unique brand of TJ-ness. Like I felt pretty certain after what he did during preseason when Tyrese and Andrew were out there that he was just going to be too good not to play. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't exactly a surprise that after 2 games he was back in the lineup. And for Andrew, like his role just kind of became, after having a pretty dynamic summer league, his role was smaller because of Bruce Brown, and yet he did the Bruce Brown things better than Bruce Brown. But when you paid Bruce Brown $20 million last summer, he was pretty much going to retain the starting spot. So I think it just makes sense for him to start out at the wing position and then get to run some of the offense himself, because obviously he did pretty well as the primary ball handler in the Eastern Conference Finals. So for the Pacers, the one thing that's really good about the extension aspect of this is that their numbers, when they have any 2 of TJ, Tyrese, and Andrew on the floor, I think they're like plus 5.4 per 100 possessions when they have two of their 3 point guards on the floor. Rick Carlisle's very good at assembling multi-point guard offenses. For them, as long as Andrew's signed on the dotted line, this becomes easy for them because he's a pretty easy player to plug in and play. And if you're not, he's not a star yet, but if you're not going to be a star, being easy is probably the next best thing to being a star. So
I'm really excited about, what's in store for Nembhard moving forward. I mean, he's coming off of great experience with Team Canada, where he had a larger role than Tyrese Haliburton. I mean, he got to pour in 18 points in one game. And honestly, you can make an argument that he even outplayed a guy like Jamal Murray, who struggled for Team Canada. Now he's got the contract. It's one less thing to worry about. He's financially set moving forward. What do you think that we could reasonably expect as it relates to growth for Andrew Nembhard moving forward? Being in that shooting guard role, he knows what his role is coming into this year. Everything's kind of set up for him to be able to have a really good year.
Yeah, his role was a little bit back and forth with Team Canada. I think like what you just mentioned, I would have rather seen he and Murray flip-flop roles a little bit. More like what we saw in Spain against Spain down the stretch. Spain was playing a box and one and really face guarding Shea, some of the types of coverages that Tyrese was seeing. You got to see Andrew use Shea a little bit more as a ball screener and get out into space. I think two things that I wanted to keep an eye on with him, and in that game, he did it. Not necessarily that it's going to be completely translatable, but he moved into the corner and relocated and hit a movement three. The more Pacers that can hit movement threes around Tyrese and potentially be a screener in that way, I think is quite helpful. To this point, Andrews more so. His numbers, his effective field goal percentage as a movement screener is good, but the volume is quite low. Another thing that I would watch for from him is that I think he needs to get better at drawing and using contact. He uses a lot of shot fakes, but he doesn't actually use the shot fake, if that makes sense. He's very heady with getting players in the air, but then once he did, he's almost too ethical to grift and actually use that contact to get to the line. I know that's something that he mentioned up at Team Canada camp as well as something that he wanted to continue to improve at. So those two things, I do think that his handle could still continue to get a little bit tighter in certain situations. I think that there was times, in FIBA ball, because there isn't defensive 3 seconds, where he could be a little bit hesitant and didn't trust that to the degree that he probably needed to in order to be getting downhill and penetrating the paint. So I think those are probably the three main things. And then I think we can probably all agree to maybe cut back on some of those 3 shot fouls. Maybe just a bit. There's a lot of those in the playoffs, and it continued with Team Canada.
Yeah, it's tough though. It's tough to guard these really, great gifted guards like Dame Lillard, Jalen Brunson, and be out there guarding them full court and then try not to get in foul trouble. I mean, it's tough. It's a lot easier said than done, but I agree. Just more discipline is going to help him next year. Now, we're going to take a drastic turn here, Caitlin. We're going to go to the end of the roster because
cool.
One of the more recent signings was a guy that I don't think a lot of Pacer fans are familiar with, and that's Cole Swider. Was signed onto a non-guaranteed contract. I know he shot the ball very well for the Summer League Miami Heat team. From what you've seen from him, how do you like, his potential fit here with Indiana?
Yeah, people want to go check it out. I did a post, which even if you're not super interested in Cole Swider, might be interesting for the rest of the players, because what I just mentioned with Andrew Nembhard, where not all catch and shoot threes are created the same and not all movement threes are created the same. So I charted all of the Pacers' effective field goal percentage on standstill threes against movement threes. And the best movement shooter for the Pacers was Tyrese Haliburton last year, hence why he ended up filling some of that buddy role and why they're kind of still looking on the margins, I feel, because Doug McDermott's effective field goal percentage on those shots was 37%, which granted, some of that's because he missed 10 games with the calf injury, but he is a shooter, as I'm sure fans will remember. He needed to start in the left corner and fly off to his right. That's why he fits so well with Sabonis. Well, when you're playing with Tyrese and TJ, they want to attack and get downhill with their right, so it really behooves the Pacers to find a movement shooter who wants to start in the right corner and fly out of those actions so that they can get downhill going into their dominant hands. Cole Swider did that more frequently than Doug did throughout his career, not as frequently as I think you probably want to see that number quite be. He didn't take a lot of shots going off of screens out to in that direction off screen plays. So I think overall, I'm not opposed to with the 15th roster spot, depending upon how that shakes out at training camp and what exactly the specifications on that deal are, because I don't think anyone still completely knows.
No.
Is that I like the idea of having a specialist there, because even though I know it kind of became a pun to be like, why is Doug McDermott in this game in the playoffs? There are times where sometimes at the end of the bench, that guy's not going to be playing regular minutes in a 15th spot role. But if you're playing the Milwaukee Bucks and they're in a zone in the playoffs and you want to throw Doug out there for 2 minutes so he can hit a three in the corner so that Milwaukee will stop playing zone, kind of makes sense. Or if you're running Jenny Busic's football style play and you just want a movement shooter out there that can set a brush screen and get Aaron Nesmith free to the corner, kind of makes sense. And then that's by comparison. I don't know what you guys fully thought of all of the summer league guys. I didn't get to hear your reactions to that yet, but like in comparison to Kendall Brown, a number that I like to throw out there with him is he shot 26% on 4 threes per game in the G League last year. Like over the last 5 years in the NBA Finals, there's only been 2 role players who have shot below 30% on 4 threes per 36 minutes, and that's Maxi Kleber and Derek Jones Jr. this past year, which Maxi was ramping up for an injury. Derek Jones Jr. no longer plays for the Mavs and was getting ignored abundantly above the break throughout that final series in ways that really reoriented their offense. So needless to say, the kind of archetype that Kendall Brown is doesn't really exist deep into the playoffs. I think sometimes there can be a little bit of a fallacy that I think a lot of times teams are a lot more willing to hide shooters defensively and find ways to cover up some of their defensive flaws than they necessarily are to find ways to make up for defensive first players that are more in the mold of Kendall Brown, especially if the defense isn't overwhelmingly special like what Derek Jones Jr.'s was throughout the playoffs. So I would probably, without having seen them in training camp or know what will come in preseason, I would probably lean towards Swider in that spot at this point in time.
And that's honestly where I'm gonna interject in that, because I'm with you on that. And look, I think it's hard to be high on Kendall Brown right now. Like I don't think anyone's buying Kendall Brown stock. But you look at Cole Swider, and I had to look him up, when they first signed him, and I saw a guy that for his first 3 years in college at Villanova didn't really do too much, transfers to Syracuse, puts together an all right season, but he's always been able to hit the 3-ball well. Look in the G League. This is someone who dominated in the G League. He averaged about 25 points per game last year, shot 50% from 3 on over 9 attempts. I have not seen anything even close from a Kendall Brown standpoint where you can feel confident to play him in a meaningful moment for the Pacers. Do you feel it was far more of a, hey, let's reward one of our guys with the two-way spot, with a guaranteed roster spot last year when there was no real path for playing time? Because that Kendall Brown spot, only $250,000 of it is guaranteed on opening night. So the Pacers can very well make that decision to move on from at any point. Do you feel that it's kind of Cole Swider at this point or Kendall Brown?
Yeah, I mean, obviously some of the other guys could potentially compete for that spot as well, but they've filled out the two-way deals at this point with the 3 players that I would have predicted that they would have. So that's kind of the way that I look at it. And it probably doesn't hurt to bring Kendall Brown to camp, but I just thought there was a sequence at Summer League, especially in the game against Minnesota, that was really telling, where Kendall caught the ball in the corner, had yards of space to shoot, stepped out of bounds with his back heel to try to explode off of it, and then literally on the next possession caught it there again, and it was a tight contest, and he didn't even strike iron shooting the ball. Like, that's the wrong read 2 possessions in a row. And then it would be something if you could be like, okay, well, they played small. They played Kendall Brown at the 5 some, and maybe he was a dynamic screener. But then there was times where they would have him do, some of that high-low action that they were running between Oscar and Jarace. They'd have Kendall in that same spot, and he was standing behind the switch, where Jarace was at least trying to get in front of it, seal, get to the front of the rim. So there's not like one crystallized skill that I can point to for Kendall Brown and be like, that's the thing. That's what's going to get him on the floor in the same way that you can with some of the other people on the back end of the roster.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I feel like there's just nothing that really stands out with his game that makes you feel like, okay, this is why we want to have him around. Where you maybe look at the last guy that got the 2-way spot, Enrique Freeman. I did find it kind of interesting that they made the announcement that both Newton and Jackson got agreed to those deals, and they left that kind of hanging fruit right there with Enrique Freeman, and it kind of felt like maybe they were considering giving him a similar deal maybe to a Cole Swider, where they didn't know for sure if they wanted to maybe give him Kendall Brown's spot. But I think based on what I saw in Summer League, I'm more intrigued by what Enrique Freeman can do than what Kendall Brown can do. And I don't know if you feel the same way, but I think Enrique Freeman's a very interesting player. I like his story as well. I know he's a little bit older, but just what he was able to do in Summer League as well, just his activity, made you realize, to me at least anyway, like this is a guy that I'm kind of intrigued by.
Yeah, I thought he was the most intriguing of the people that were on the back end of the roster on the Summer League team.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason why Oscar wasn't really playing many fourth quarter minutes and Enrique was, because Enrique was a lot more switchable. Defensively, he can use a drop step and block a shot with his weak hand. I thought he made some pretty intuitive reads overall defensively to be able to potentially plug into a couple different roles. And then offensively, when you see him put the ball on the floor a couple times with his left and finish, the fact that he made a couple pick and pop threes, he could do something as the roll man, did some things with run outs. There were times where you could hear that he needed direction from the bench in terms of where he needed to be spacing when he wasn't screening for the ball or he didn't necessarily know where to relocate. So that's something to keep an eye on. But for me, I think that's something good to have at the back end. He can potentially play the 4. Maybe he plays some 5 for you, put him in the G League, see what he can do. My overall opinion with it was I would have looked at Quentin Jackson, Tristan Newton, and Enrique with the 3 two-way contracts. And then if I wouldn't have known about Cole Swider, I probably would have left that roster spot open. And then if one of them impressed me, then maybe they become next season's Kendall Brown without as many limitations.
Yeah.
And then you still maintain the flexibility.
Yeah, G League accolades could be a little, I don't know, overblown, whatever word you want to use for it. We've seen G League MVPs not be able to contribute much at all to any team. Oscar Tshiebwe was the G League Rookie of the Year. He's got one skill set that is elite. He is a really good rebounder, but sometimes that's just not enough. How tough of a decision do you think this was for the Pacers to be able to say, hey, look, we're not even going to offer him another two-way, deal. And now at this point for Oscar, I'm not really sure what else is out there. I mean, a team could pick him up, but it looks like his time in Indiana is over.
Yeah, unfortunately for him, it's going to sound counterintuitive, but the Pacers are not a good rebounding team. And yet the Pacers aren't necessarily a good fit for him because in order for his best skill to show up, you have to be a team that forces enough stops for him to be able to get a rebound. If you don't force a lot of stops, he's not really going to get to show that main skill. And like I said, in the first game, Summer League game against Brooklyn, he played 10 minutes. And the other 4, he played less than 5 minutes in the fourth quarter, in part because he doesn't have great spatial awareness, especially against the pick and pop, to be able to locate the screener. There's times where he'll just automatically think that screener is going to roll and then he loses his place, or it's like a quick wave where he doesn't necessarily want to get out to the paint in order to contest some of those shots. So his ability to defend spread lineups makes things tough. And then if he does switch, you could notice that the Pacers were really having to shrink the floor behind him in order to make up for that. So I did think he had some fun passing flashes in his game. Yeah. The high-low stuff that worked with Jarace mainly worked because of his ability to deliver those passes on time and on target in ways that the other bigs really weren't necessarily doing. But without him being able to add other stuff there, he's mainly a guy that plays out of the dunker spot, is going to be getting stuff off cuts because he's going to gobble up offensive rebounds in that way. So defensively, he's not necessarily adding the versatility that the Pacers needed at that spot. And I think that they still ranked like 25th in first chance defense. So like I said, if you're ranking 25th in first chance defense, then Oscar's not really getting as many opportunities to finish plays with defensive rebounds, and he's not helping you manufacture those stops. So I think that's really what it came down to. Like Enrique just offers you a wider way of skills, particularly at that end of the floor.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Oscar Tshiebwe last year gave the Pacers a lot of good content. He was the guy that got the game ball, for me honest, right? So that definitely helped. And then, like Facci mentioned G League Rookie of the Year. And I will say this, he's probably one of the most fun interviews just because he's a hilarious human being. So, I will miss that aspect of not having his personality on the team, but I understand the basketball reasons are the reason why you sign players, and it's not just for how they, are personality-wise. But
unless it's James Johnson.
Exactly, right? But I mean, that is just irreplaceable. We saw how that worked last year when he was not on the team and why they brought him back. But, I do want to talk about Johnny Furphy, the Pacers pick that was high in the second round. They traded up to get him from San Antonio. And Rick Carlisle said, I believe he was like number 14 on their big board, which I thought was really revealing. You don't usually hear that from a coach or a front office telling you where their players are ranked at. But your thoughts on Johnny Furphy, how he played in Summer League and how he fits in with this team?
Yeah, so I mean, he was 5 of 22 on spot up threes, and 4 of the 5 makes came in the corners. And I think that you could kind of tell that on the Kansas film that right now he's more so a standstill shooter, and particularly he's better from the corners than above the break, although he did make the one self-created 3 above the break, which was nice to see. They did run a couple sets where they had him curling into the corners too, as well, where he got to do a few more things. I think he surprised me defensively. He held up fairly decently at the end of the game against Denver when they were going at him several possessions in a row. He uses his length pretty decently, but there were also times where he was switching on to bigs and getting buried pretty deep under the stanchion. And because it's summer league and passes aren't always made, he didn't exactly get punished for that in ways that I expect that he would at the next level. I think, he's only 19. He's going to need to add strength and physicality to his game for some of that stuff that he was doing defensively to hold up better than what the summer league kind of masked it as. But I thought you could see that he would plug into a lot of the Pacers' actions really nicely. And the fact that he can shoot the three and he has the athleticism off of 2 feet, we saw what he could do in transition. The fit's pretty natural, I think, both in the half court and in the open floor, where you could see him potentially plugging in eventually into a lot of what they do, especially if he's playing off of TJ McConnell. I thought that there was a couple sets that they ran when Tristan Newton was better at running the offense, it was out of set plays. And when they ran pistol and had Johnny Furphy 45 cutting, that looked pretty decent. I was like, if he's out there with TJ, he'll get a lot of those types of opportunities. So I didn't think it was great when they were running some 1-4 flat stuff, and it came pretty easy to score on he and Jarace in combination at the end of the few of the quarters. But overall, I think that that's a pretty decent pick for them, especially given that we know that they're pretty deep in rotation players already. So for them to go with a little bit of an upside pick and a younger player that's likely going to be playing in the G League anyways, I think that makes quite a bit of sense, especially if he fits offensively with what they do. Although I do think kind of the overall theme of the offseason was them finding players who augment some of what the offense already is without necessarily addressing some of their needs at the other end of the floor. But I'm sure we'll probably get to that later.
Yeah, I mean, now when we look at this between Johnny Furphy, being on the roster, between Tristan Newton and Enrique Freeman locking down two-way spots, the Pacers have a spot for all three of their draft picks. Is that something that you were, I don't know, maybe surprised about coming into the draft? Because I did not think the Pacers would use all three picks, let alone have 3 spots for these players. Figure one of them could have been a stash like Mojave King was. And, at this point, what were your thoughts on all 3 of these players landing with the Pacers?
I did not think that they would use all 3 picks because they're already a fairly young basketball team. So I thought that there might be some type of a consolidation trade. But given what the reporting was on this draft, I didn't do intensive draft coverage because of the extended playoffs for the Pacers. So I wasn't really in the know about how good this draft exactly was, where I can give my own insights on it. But given that what the overall draft was, I doubt there was a lot of teams looking to trade into this year's draft at the expense of future draft picks. So the Pacers ended up keeping all 3. And like you said, the fact that they're able to have all of the two-way contracts available, I don't think that I was necessarily surprised that Oscar isn't staying on one of the two-way contracts and that Quentin Jackson is going to be staying. That part isn't necessarily surprising to me as much as the fact that they kept all 3 picks in the first place.
Yeah, that was definitely surprising. I was like, where are they going to find spots for these? And, it's interesting, but they did what they had to do. And I think the extra two-way spot made it more of an intriguing reason why to keep somebody, especially if they like somebody, which I think they did there with Enrique Freeman. But let's go back to the top of the roster now. I think this is where it gets really interesting because the Pacers bring back both power forwards, Pascal Siakam and Obi Toppin, on new deals. And so Pascal Siakam, obviously, the 4 years, $189 million deal. Pretty good deal for both sides, it feels like. But your thoughts on Indiana giving him that large of a pay, that large pay day for him, and then what you saw from his play last year that you think can carry over with what you mentioned earlier with, the training camp and things like that.
So, I think as soon as they traded for him, we probably all knew that he was getting a max contract. Yeah. He wanted a max contract from Toronto. Toronto reportedly didn't want to give him a max contract. So that part wasn't quite as surprising for me. The 4 years was maybe a little bit more of a surprise. I think that I'm not concerned with his game aging out, especially offensively. The things that he does, I think that are going to hold up over the length of that contract. Defensively, I talked about with you guys when we did a preview pod before they had actually traded for him. And I said, I think that his defense is probably a little bit lower than what overall expectations are. And I think that that was mainly still my opinion. We're in game 4 of the Eastern Conference Finals and he's not guarding Jaylen Brown or Jason Tatum. It's a little bit tricky. And I have an article coming out about this pretty soon. Like, as much as Siakam and Miles Turner complement each other offensively, and it makes sense why Pascal had Miles ranked so highly as among the players that he would love to play with, defensively, they're going to have to reckon with how to reconcile the two of them, because Pascal is a player who needs to switch a lot more. he really struggles with screen navigation. He's a big body, which means he's a big target, and you don't want to switch as much as they were end up switching in game 4 against Boston, even though Miles did have a bad back, which needs to be added there. But they also kind of need to play the same role to an extent. Like, I think a lot of times Miles is better in rim protection than he is as a ball side anchor. And right now, if Siakam's not going to be guarding primary assignments because of what his overall offensive impact is, I liked him in the roamer role a lot better in the semifinal series against the Knicks when they were having him do a lot of that out of the ball side corners off of Precious Achiuwa, roaming, clear, flooding, strong side off of Josh Hart. I thought it was a little bit more impactful to have him as a shadow presence than necessarily defending within the action. So that's something that they're going to have to figure out, or hope that they get improvements from other players around those two that we haven't necessarily quite seen yet headed into next year. But yeah, I mean, I agreed with the Pacers when they said that was their top priority. Absolutely, it should have been. And I think headed into next year's training camp, like I've talked about it on a couple different podcasts, but you could see throughout the playoffs that the two-man game chemistry between Tyrese and Siakam was developing, things that we weren't seeing during the regular season. You know, to see them playing an empty side pick and roll, have Pascal pop to the elbow, do a pop and get so Tyrese can still get middle. If he gets top locked, he's sandwiching that top lock for a potential inverted pick and roll for Pascal. Pascal's rejecting it and getting into the middle of the paint. Those types of things weren't readily being seen shortly after the trade happened. I think that's only going to continue to get better. And then what I said defensively, like the scheme from Toronto, especially for the many years that he played under Nick Nurse, that was a team that gave up a lot of corner threes. They were very aggressive with their overall coverages, trying to force steals. The Pacers, the exact opposite. Last season in closeouts, stayed home on the three-point line, really limited three-point attempts, and were more dependent on guys staying in front of the ball. We can debate to what degree that ended up working for them, but the scheme is very much different. And I thought you could tell shortly after the trade that there was a lot of times where he wasn't exactly in the know with some of his off-ball rotations, which ended up being slower than what you'd want to see. And just from a conditioning aspect too, like, I don't know if he's actually talked about this, but Toronto also played very up-tempo. They also had him run and do early work, but the Pacers don't just run off of misses. They run off of makes, and then they're also expecting you to be doing a lot of press defense. That's a lot to come over and try to, uptake to mid-season. So I think all that with the training camp, I think that you can expect some of his off-ball defense and his team defense within the scheme to improve. I don't think that that's necessarily going to change some of what, the overall fit is with the front court with some of the defensive stuff. But I think that's kind of where I overall land with Pascal. Obviously a huge piece for them. Really big in the first two games against Milwaukee, really big in game 6 against the New York Knicks, and then continuing to be pretty solid throughout the series in Boston. Just for everybody that likes to talk about the playoff run being somewhat, quote unquote fluke for the Pacers because of the injuries, I like to point out the Pacers outscored every opponent every round of the playoffs, including Boston, when Tyrese and Pascal were on the floor. So that's the one thing that I like to stick and toe away from what that playoff run was.
Say it louder for the people in the back.
I love that. No, that is a great stat. And you also made a great point. Last episode, talking about how it's just no one talks about how Tyrese Haliburton was banged up. It's just only talking about how the teams the Pacers played that were banged up. So I thought that was another good call by you. But talk to me about the Obi Toppin signing. Now, in this scenario, I felt like Obi coming to the Pacers was the perfect fit for both parties, really for Obi to be able to flourish. And flourish he did. He had such an efficient season. It's going to be hard to top, but talk to me about how maybe Obi could continue to get better with another year under his belt, being familiar with this offense, the team around him. What could we expect for maybe Obi moving forward?
The fact that one thing that I would say is that Obi Toppin still saw quite a few short closeouts last year. It's like the opponents weren't necessarily reacting yet to the fact that he shot the three really well and made strides with his three-point shot. So if he continues to do that, some things might open up for him a little bit off the dribble, although he's not known for creating his own shots, but just in closeout situations, he might get a little bit more opportunities there if he can string back-to-back seasons of shooting the three as well as he did. Another one of my favorite Pacer-related stats, Obi Toppin, the first player in Pacers history to make 100 threes and convert 100 dunks. That's pretty cool for him to be able to say that. And like you said, tremendously efficient season, top 10, second, I believe, in true shooting percentage. And that's with him shooting a lot of threes, which wasn't the case for most of the other players in the top 10. I think the only other player who shot the same amount or more threes than Obi there was Grayson Allen with the Phoenix Suns. So tremendous play finisher for the Pacers. I think my only thought there when I saw that signing come in is I probably would have been okay to see if there would have been a way for the Pacers to add another wing defender first. Or maybe they attempted to, maybe they sniffed around and thought, there isn't going to be, so we'll quickly re-sign with Obi. I don't have any issue with them retaining Obi. Obviously what he and TJ did throughout the second half of the season once he moved back to the second unit was big for the Pacers, and they had several big games, game 6 against the Milwaukee Bucks in the playoffs, with them working in tandem that made a big difference. But we also saw game 4 where, they take Miles out at the end of the game. Alex and I talked about it when we were sitting there, and we're like, as soon as Miles came out, they just started going at Obi, like 3 possessions in a row with Tatum and Jaylen Brown. So the switching, with Obi, it's not so much like a schematic issue. He has very high hips and he's built very angular, so it makes it very hard. He's great at moving in straight lines. It makes it very hard for him to backpedal and change directions, which means it's harder for him to be able to switch out to players like that. Of course, we're only talking about one particular opponent, but that one particular opponent did win the NBA championship and is likely still going to be somebody that the Pacers are going to have to reckon with in the playoffs if they want to maintain that same degree of success. So that's kind of where I look at, again, some of the defensive versatility for the Pacers. But my main reaction when they signed him was, is this going to eventually lead to a consolidation trade at some point? Because when you look at it, like with his spot there, not that Jarace can't play the 3. I think that there were some things that I saw at Summer League that made me more convinced he could play the 3. But it's going to be really hard for you to play Andrew Nembhard, Bennedict Mathurin, Ben Shepherd, and Jarace Walker. I don't really know how they're playing all 4 of those players. It's likely going to be a choice between Ben Shepherd and Jarace Walker. So that makes it trying to develop young players at the same time as you're trying to win games once you also signed Obi Toppin. Because as much as the Pacers like to run and as much press defense as they like to play, I don't know if it's realistic to expect them to play an 11-man rotation.
Yeah, I don't really see that coming, and I definitely agree with you. I think it's between Shepherd and Walker to get that last 10th man spot in the rotation. And the way that Carlisle raves about Shepherd, I think it's going to be hard for Walker to beat him out just because of where he's at defensively, so much further advanced than Jarace is right now. But before we get to those players, I do want to talk about Bennedict Mathurin because I think a lot of people are excited for what his potential can become. And a lot of our YouTube commenters, always every episode we talk about Mathurin, they always call us Mathurin haters and Andrew Nembhard stands. And so it's like,
let's not start that. Let's not start that. It doesn't need to be combative. They offer completely different things.
Thank you. It's the new Turner versus Sabonis thing.
It really is.
Where it's like, you can't like both of them. And I'm just like, okay. But Mathurin, I think for me at least, I felt like he was showing some steps of progression before the injury. So I was really disappointed because I felt like he was getting better. And I think we were kind of seeing it post All-Star break in those few short games there. Like he had some nice moments. So I'm kind of curious your thoughts on, obviously coming back from this injury, but like, what are your expectations for him next season? Because right now, I think the starting lineup is pretty solidified. He's going to have to really work his way to get in there and kind of take that spot from Nesmith at the 3. I think that he's pretty locked in right now to that backup 2 guard.
For all of the Mathurin stands, I will tell you that there are shots that Bennedict Mathurin can access that nobody on the roster can access. That's the reality, and he was their most efficient player in isolation last year. Now, that's not comparable volume to how many isolations Pascal's getting per 100 possessions or Tyrese, but 1.176 points per chance out of isolation. That's definitely something he made strides getting to his own shot, particularly in 2-point range in ways that we didn't see from him as a rookie. I think that he was making more of an effort to make the right read, but he wasn't always making the right read. Yeah. So he's better, like the game that he played against Detroit where he had multiple assists, he's better when he's operating out of plays than when he's playing at random. Being able to make quick decisions even against a closeout and make the right decision still isn't necessarily a strength for him. And then defensively, he's not a great point of attack defender when it comes to screen navigation. Some of his defense on ball, when he doesn't have to navigate a screen, is ahead of his off-ball defense. And that's kind of saying something because I don't think that his on-ball defense is quite comparable to Nembhard and Shepherd's to this point in time. But that being said, I would agree with you that if he's going to compete for a starting spot, this is why we don't need to make it about Nembhard versus Ben, because I would more so see that being a toss-up between Mathurin and Nesmith because of what we saw in the playoffs. Nesmith played a very important role pressing up against Jalen Brunson in that series against the Knicks, but his three-point percentage, drops from 41% during the regular season to 27.8% in the playoffs. And that's not just the difference between making and missing shots. It's also the fact that, like, big for him to make the pull-up twos in Game 7 in Madison Square Garden, but he only made a total of 10 of those, made a total of 17 during the regular season. When he gets run off the line, it's very hard for him to recapture his rhythm and generate a second three-point attempt. So if he needs to take like a one dribble sidestep three, that doesn't happen often for him. Like 88% of his threes are without a dribble. So if Mathurin was going to edge his way back into the starting lineup, I think it would be there. And in order for him to do that, it's the same things that we talk about with Jarace. In order for him to do that, it's mainly for Mathurin going to be about what he can do at the defensive end of the floor, especially if Siakam isn't going to be a guy that you're assigning to wings. It's going to be what can Bennedict Mathurin be doing against top assignments. And I think right now he hasn't quite shown that yet. I'd have to see what he looks like at preseason, post-injury, see what he looks like at the start of the season. But I will say overall, like, we haven't really seen the fit between Bennedict Mathurin and Tyrese yet. They haven't won those minutes last season, this season. We know what the net rating is. I think it was the worst of any rotation player on the Pacers, according to Cleaning the Glass, when Ben's on versus off, and a lot of that has to do with the defensive numbers to this point in time. So I think that Ben plays really well with TJ McConnell. TJ activates him as a cutter. TJ looks for him in transition. There's certain set plays that they run where, if Tyrese was out there and Mathurin gets a secondary pick and roll, the ball is likely going to get swung back with a boomerang pass to Tyrese. If he's out there with TJ, Mathurin gets to keep the ball and make a read out of the secondary pick and roll. So that's why his usage swings quite a bit when he's not playing with Tyrese versus when he is playing with Tyrese. So I don't really hate it as having this very high level six man. There's things that you can look at throughout the playoffs and be like, wow, it would have been nice to have Bennedict Mathurin scoring in that particular situation. It would have been nice to have somebody, puncture and really attack the gap defense against the Milwaukee Bucks, or certain things that different teams are doing defensively. So right now I still see him as a high level six man, but he can obviously, not that my opinion really matters, but he could certainly change my opinion on that depending upon how he looks in preseason and what potential strides he's made defensively. But I will say a lot of the stuff defensively is awareness. It's not necessarily effort. Sometimes like he'll make a really strong initial thrust and then he'll relax, but overall it's awareness. And I don't know if you can always tamp that up in the same way that if it's an effort issue, you can be like, okay, I can expect that guy to give, higher level effort in the playoffs. So that's why it's difficult with Mathurin, because a lot of the stuff with him on both ends of the floor is feel, and that's really difficult to project. Sometimes, the switch clicks and it all comes together, and with what skills he already has, like, that's a really good basketball player, but I can't tell you necessarily whether that's going to happen or not.
Year 3 is expected to be a big year for any player to take that step forward. It's also at the end of year 3 is typically when a lot of guys are looking to get paid. It's typically a make or break year. Do you think it's overblown to say it might be a make or break year for Mathurin's tenure as a Pacer? Or can they afford to be more patient with him? Is patience something that both parties can show? Or is it really, hey, this is a year where we're going to learn a lot about if that fit can be ideal or not?
I think at some point in time, they're going to have to make a consolidation move for the reasons we just talked about. Like, all 4 of those young players, it's going to be hard to get all of them minutes on the floor at the same time. And the thing with Ben is, it's like we said, we haven't quite yet seen the fit bear out in the numbers or necessarily defensively when he and Tyrese are on the floor at the same time. But somebody asked me this question in my mailbag about, like, if only one could stay between Jarace and Ben, which would it be? And like, Jarace right now is kind of a generalist where he has this package of skills where it's like he's unique because he can do all of those things, but he doesn't necessarily do any one of those things better than anyone else on the roster. Ben, like I said, can access shots in a way that nobody else on the roster can. When Rick said that after that game against Boston, it was like, the shot that Kristaps Porzingis fouled him on, the foul did get overturned. But the shot that Kristaps Porzingis fouled him on is one that nobody else on the team could take. Like, I went back and looked out of that play. Nobody else on the team has gotten that shot. So that's a thing, and that's also why he might be more valuable to other teams, right? And in other offenses that weren't necessarily more read-based, you might see Ben access more of what makes Ben, if that makes sense. So, like, I think that his value will still probably be there for other teams. So I would probably lean that way, but we're a long way down the road on that. I think that they do have time to be patient right now and look at what they have in Jarace and Ben and Nembhard and Ben Shepherd as well and evaluate that overall fit. Because I think you guys would probably agree with me when I say, like, there wasn't a clear move this summer where it's like, hey, if they trade one of those young players, that guy is going to make the Indiana Pacers better. I don't think that they're at that point, in that place in time yet, but I think that they are going to get there eventually, where they're going to have to, move some of these chips together to get somebody defensively in between Tyrese, Pascal, potentially Miles, depending upon what goes on with him, to balance out the roster a little bit better.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's just like there's too many players that are deserving of minutes, and you want Mathurin to succeed. Obviously, he was a lottery pick. You invested a lot in this player.
And that's the simplest solution. Like, honestly, that's the simplest solution. If Ben takes a step forward, then this is pretty easy for the Pacers.
Yeah, they don't really have to make as big of a consolidation trade if he just says, okay, Nesmith, you're a good player, but it's my time now. Let me go out here and show how I can defend. And I think, we talk about it all the time, but like defensively, that's where it's got to be for him. I mean, I understand like the passing aspect of it too with the offense and the catch and shoot. Like he got better as a catch and shoot player last year, but if he can just really develop defensively, I think that's what's going to end up getting him more minutes. And I've talked about this on the podcast as well. I wonder if he would be okay with coming off the bench if it still meant that he would close a lot of the games. And I wonder if that's something that they would lean heavily or, heavy on Rick Carlisle, if Mathurin's, playing decent enough, if they would close with him and he would be someone they could trust to close games. And if that would help at all, maybe soften the blow a little bit with him not starting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it sounds like Ben would want to be a starter, I'm guessing. I haven't actually spoken to him about that directly. But I think it would take quite a bit at the current point in time for me to think that they would have him in a closing lineup over Nesmith. I would have to see considerable strides, I think, at the defensive end of the floor. And I mean, there were a few games last year where if he really had it going, they did lean and rely on him. And I think that that's kind of what Rick Carlisle overall prefers, is to have each game be a game into itself instead of necessarily sticking with a set rotation. But I'd be a little bit surprised by that currently.
Yeah, I always have to feel like almost pinch myself and wake up that the Pacers did make the Eastern Conference Finals last year. They did play Boston well despite getting swept. However, in the offseason, when it came to maybe advancing the team, Pacers elected to run it back. Now, running it back in 2024 is different than running it back 4 or 5 years ago, where you didn't feel that roster could really compete with the upper echelon of the East. Do you feel that Indiana has done enough or has the roster in place where they could, not to say take that next step to go to the NBA Finals, but be an absolute competitive team night in, night out with what the rest of the East has in store?
Yeah, I mean, Tyrese was one of the most impactful players in the NBA last year in terms of what the Pacers' offensive rating was when he was on the floor. I literally think he was either first or second in that particular category. The fact that their offense held up to the degree that it did in all of those rounds, particularly when he was on the floor, the stat that I just mentioned, the fact that they outscored Boston when Tyrese and Siakam were on the floor, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were going to win those games. They didn't win those games despite that stat being the case. But the fact that the offense continued to hold up as well as it did, and that the press defense, while the numbers behind the press don't reflect super well for the Pacers, and there were at times where I'm like, do I need Pascal, Siakam, and Obi Toppin pressing 94 feet? I'm not sure that I do. But it quietly allowed them, it fed their offensive identity in ways that I don't think were readily apparent, in that it allowed them to kind of artificially create their pace. And what we always say, like, oh, the game slows down in the playoffs. It didn't really slow down for the Pacers. So the fact that they were able to maintain their identity as well as they did made me think it was not as fluky, despite the fact that I can look at the Knicks series and be like, hey, if OG Anunoby or Mikal Bridges now was standing in place of Precious Achiuwa, in place of Josh Hart in some of those lineups, the coverages that the Pacers were using, they would not have been able to use. It would have been a lot more difficult, because an underrated part of it is, like, yes, the switch to put Nesmith onto Jalen Brunson was a smart one. He has more length to contest Jalen Brunson's ability to create space and step backs than Andrew Nembhard does. But a subtle part of that is that when Andrew Nembhard was no longer guarding Jalen Brunson, Andrew Nembhard's off-ball rotations were very important to what they were doing, and then also putting Andrew Nembhard on Donte DiVincenzo so that Tyrese Haliburton wasn't no longer chasing Donte DiVincenzo was very important, as was Pascal Siakam being able to help off that far so that Nesmith could press closer to Brunson. That wouldn't necessarily have been the case if the Knicks roster was completely healthy, but that being said, I don't know what adjustments the Pacers would have made in response to that adjustment. I didn't get to see it, so I can't fully project it. But that being said, that's why when people ask me that, the fact that their offense held up as well as it did makes me think that they can still be a competitive playoff team, probably more so than what I think the overall opinion and temperature of them continues to be, given that I keep seeing, as Tyrese mentioned, I keep seeing tweets where it's like, oh, top of the East, the Bucks, the Celtics, the Knicks, the Sixers, the Magic, the Cavs. Like, somebody's missing here. Somebody's missing here.
It is funny you say that, because I was just listening to Doc Rivers talk with Bill Simmons on his podcast about Team USA, and they were talking about the East there at the end. And, Doc Rivers like, we didn't even mention Indiana, and, they brought everybody back. And one thing that he mentioned too was teams that have deep benches are going to be the teams that have more success. So I think when you have a head coach of a team that's one of the upper echelon teams in the Eastern Conference saying that, I think that he's been around a long time. I think he knows what he's talking about when he says that. So we saw how the strength in numbers thing worked last year for Indiana. While we do believe it is a bit of a problem here for a consolidation trade that eventually will have to happen, I think for next season, the Pacers can really rely on that strength once again. And I don't know if it seems impossible to you, but it would not shock me if the Pacers finish with the top 3 seed in the Eastern Conference, just because of their depth and because of the team chemistry that they've already developed with the guys currently on the roster, where you see teams like New York and Philly making different, changes, kind of significant changes where you're bringing a big piece in, and that adjustment period can be a little bit more difficult. I don't know if you feel the same way, but, just kind of piggyback off what Rivers said about the bench and things like that.
I mean, the Pacers' depth is really important to them maintaining their identity too, because I don't know if you saw the interview, but Pascal's agent did an interview where he talked about the fact that Rick manages minutes so well was a big part of Pascal wanting to stay put, because he was overtaxed a lot in the Nick Nurse years, led the NBA in closeouts, was running a ton of isolations, was playing heavy minutes, top of the league in miles. Like, Pascal being able to play fewer minutes because they do have so many rotation players allows them to be able to play what is a very tiring style of basketball on both ends of the floor with what they're doing with some of their press and the things that I mentioned. But in terms of what you're asking, like, I did a Central Division preview pod a couple of weeks ago, and I was bringing up similar things to what you just said, because when you look at, like, just between here in the Central, between the Bucks and the Cavs, all 3 of those teams kind of have different priorities, in my opinion. Like, if you're the Bucks, you just absolutely have to get to the playoffs and be healthy. That has to be your number one priority over almost everything. Like, you can't get there again and not have Giannis and Dame playing in a series on a roster that's already aging. You look at Cleveland. Cleveland needs to adjust their ceiling. They already know what the floor of their defense can be. They need to try some different things during the regular season that might make them a more potent playoff team, and that might not necessarily lead to winning night in and night out. They need to be able to adjust and put the ball into Evan Mobley's hands more often, make their offense less predictable. The Pacers don't have those same 2 hurdles to really overcome. Like, yes, Tyrese needs to be healthy, but not in the same way that might lead you to potentially be, resting certain guys, as the Milwaukee Bucks might need to throughout the regular season because of, the older state of their roster. So I just think that, and like, I'm sure that the Pacers, like, I just mentioned those tweets like offhand in jest, but I'm sure that they're seeing stuff that's being talked about them, and that their run was somewhat illegitimate. So I'm sure there's going to be some, not that there needs to be extra motivation, but motivation to prove that what they did last year wasn't a fluke, and they don't have those same issues to kind of overcome and combat, in addition to what you mentioned with the chemistry. So I can buy into that to a degree.
One of those players on this roster that could, in theory, be looked at as an addition is Jarace Walker. Now, I wasn't in love with his summer league play, but I did like the fact that the Pacers are openly experimenting him at different positions, because it's going to be hard for him to get minutes at the 4, or at least any meaningful minutes. What are your thoughts on Jarace Walker going into his sophomore season, and do you think that he could help Indiana this upcoming season?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing with Jarace is that I had somebody react to me on Twitter and be like, well, I think what we learned from Summer League is that Jarace isn't a small forward. I was like, I don't think that I really learned that, because I didn't see him doing a lot at the small forward. Unfortunately for him, because they led Summer League in turnovers, many of which were his, to be fair. They didn't have a true initiator on that roster. Like, tight spaces were not that roster's friend in terms of ball handling. And that's nothing against, there's reasons to like Tristan Newton. The fact that Tristan Newton got to the line 28 times, like, that's a translatable skill, like, especially given what his shot was, that he was still able to draw contact to that degree. Quinn Jackson had the highest effective field goal percentage on that roster. He can be a dynamic slasher. His athleticism, what he was doing with press defense, I think that's something that's like, hey, if you need him in a pinch, he's out there. That meant that the Pacers didn't really have a point guard. Jarace was doing a lot of point guarding. His handle wasn't necessarily taking him anywhere in the half court. I thought some of his reads and some of the late game situations in terms of reading taggers weren't exactly where it needs to be, but that's him doing initiation that he's not going to be doing on a roster with Tyrese and TJ and Andrew Nembhard on it, most likely. So when he's a wing connector, like a possession I really liked, I don't know why the opponent put 2 on the ball against Tristan Newton. That's a fair question to ask, but he gets blitzed. Tyrese gets blitzed a lot. So if you imagine Tyrese gets blitzed, throws it to Jarace Walker at the wing, and Jarace Walker at the wing throws like the perfect lob pass over the top to Enrique Freeman, shorting the roll from the wing. That's him being a connector, and it worked in part because Jarace's shot continues to be holding up steadily for him. The hitch that was there last summer, no longer there. The drifting to the left that was there visible during preseason, no longer there. The Pacers in the G League did a lot, and credit to Jarace, put the work into where the shot was, and he continues to make catch and shoot threes in a way that lead me to think he could do some wing things. That being said, he got to the rim a lot more often, which was good to see, especially by comparison to the fact that like floater versus rim has been almost even for him his freshman season at Houston and last year in the G League. Got to the rim 16 times. He just didn't finish particularly well when he got there. I'm sure that you guys were noticing some of the stuff. Like, he was active at sealing a switch, but sometimes when he would get there, I just wanted him to take a gather dribble, actually use his shoulder, clear some space, and get to the rim rather than some of the fadeaways. Then the issue that I see mostly for Jarace is that the things that were brought up, that I brought up last year as to why he wasn't playing, that they were looking for in terms of conditioning, high motor, hard, consistent play, and then just being able to take on a defensive matchup, I didn't think were quite consistent enough. And especially for somebody that's on the margins of the defensive rotation, I would have liked to see quite a bit more there. I mean, there were times defensive matchup-wise, like he was guarding Rob Dillingham for times against Minnesota, and especially in minutes when Ben Sheppard was out there. And I don't know if they just wanted to see, like, hey, can Jarace do this? But it didn't go particularly well. And then you have, like, Ben Sheppard as the low man. That doesn't really work. I'm seeing some possessions where Jarace is ducking under an entire action, or Jarace in transition doesn't really fully get back, and then it's just like a light swipe. And then you'll notice on the next possession, he's full on picking up full court. So it's not always a question of can Jarace do something. Sometimes it's a question of will he do it consistently, which I think, I don't want to say is concerning, but it's a little bit questionable as to why that is when he wasn't somebody who was regularly in the rotation last year and the coaching staff was publicly talking about the things that they wanted to see from him, and then it didn't necessarily bear out. And then just like, if you're looking at him to be a wing-size wing defender, and they definitely do have a Jarace Walker-shaped hole in that particular regard, you need some of his body of work to start adding up to what his body size is. And there were times where he's just too dependent on his hands. He's okay in late clock situations if he's defending the screener and he switches out, which is somewhat similar to Pascal. It got a little bit dicier if he was just having to defend as the screen navigator, or if he was just defending in like a regular isolation situation earlier in the clock where he was having to stay in front of the ball, and then it becomes more about, sometimes he's poking from behind, which he does have a really long wingspan. Sometimes he comes up with those steals, but it wasn't as much about his mobility as it was his slide deft hands, which do suit him well at times, but also led to some blow-by drives. So I don't know that I would say that they consistently saw enough if those are the things that they're looking for, like what Alex mentioned earlier, to say, oh, Jarace is going to be in the rotation over Ben Sheppard.
Yeah,
I would have a tough time saying that unless when he's in a more natural role during preseason and he's playing more so like a small forward and he's not having to do as much of the initiation, and maybe he continues on with the program that he's been on this summer and I see more from him defensively, then I could say, like, yeah, he's definitely going to be the 10th man in the rotation. But right now I don't think that you can say that. And that's where it gets tricky, because you can see and be like, well, if these things were all clicking for him, he could be an answer to fortify some of what their defensive issues are, but I don't think you can make a strong case for that right now, right here today.
Yeah, and I think we always kind of go back to maybe he will play more with the three just because Chad Buchanan's come on this podcast a few different times and mentioned, hey, we kind of like Jarace at the three maybe more than we thought we do when we drafted him. We thought he might solely be a four, but there's seems like some potential there to be a three. So it'll be interesting. Last year, Ben Mathurin was put into the starting lineup, didn't last super long. Rick Carlisle changed that pretty quick, went back to Buddy Hield. So it wouldn't maybe surprise me if Jarace did start out as the backup small forward to start the season off over Shep. But if he didn't really earn it over the first couple of weeks and they felt like they were taking a step back, maybe Carlisle goes back to the Shepherd lineup. But still, I think it's just Jarace is in a different spot than Mathurin was last year. But moving on, because I know we're getting late here a little bit with our time. So James Wiseman was brought in as kind of the third string center. Isaiah Jackson ended up taking over the backup center spot for Jalen Smith out throughout the playoffs. And now Jalen Smith has left and went to Chicago. So I think Ijack's becoming the full-time backup. It's pretty interesting to see kind of how he got there based on how it's been kind of a roller coaster for him the first couple of years of his career. And then them bringing in James Wiseman. Curious your thoughts on the Wiseman addition, as well as Ijack's kind of now having what seems like a bigger role moving forward.
Yeah, the thing with James Wiseman is this is why I said it. Kind of the theme of the offseason was they found players that they think could project and take steps forward to fit what they do, or who already fit what they do, but they didn't necessarily answer the things that are their weaknesses. So like when I wrote the article, I talked about on James Wiseman and the Pacers feeding their own beast. So like in Detroit, the Pistons ranked 26th points per chance on picks, out of picks scoring, and 29th in points per chance defending picks. The Pacers are top 5 and bottom 5 in both of those areas. So if the expectation is, which I think that it's reasonable to think that James Wiseman will take steps forward as a screener in the pick and roll, playing with Tyrese and Andrew and TJ. As I said, he's a player that needs to get fed, and he's playing with 3 silver spoons. It's reasonable to think that, despite the fact that he's a fairly low feel player. His screening technique and the angles that he takes as a screener are going to need to get cleaned up. And then also, like, he has a very strange relationship with a pound dribble where sometimes he'll try to take way too much ground and then he'll miss the passing read to the corner, or he won't get anywhere with it. Like Marvin Bagley will be guarding him and he'll take a pound dribble and he doesn't go anywhere despite having taken it. Like, he's not creating any space for himself. So those things are concerning, but I do think that, like what we've seen with Miles Turner playing with Tyrese, Miles' efficiency jumped quite a bit once he was being coached by Rick and with Tyrese. So I think that James could take steps in that particular regard. That said, on the other end of the floor, people are like, well, he's not going to be playing in what was, for lack of better terms, like a really toxic situation in Detroit anymore. I'm like, that's true, but the Pacers ranked 28th in points per chance defending the pick and roll. Like, so he's going from 29th to 28th. It's not like there's going to be tremendously better infrastructure around him as they drop big. And he's definitely somebody who he only switched on 5% of his screens with the Pistons. Like, he needs to be playing with a guard who chases in hard rear view pursuit. And sometimes, like, that will apply to Ben Shepherd, but as you just mentioned, like, if Ben's not in the rotation, then he's going to be more so playing with Bennedict Mathurin, which doesn't necessarily apply in that same respect, where, like, Ben, if he needs to veer switch, sometimes he veers way too early before the ball breaks the free throw line, and then that's going to get left with James Wiseman. So I don't know necessarily defensively that I think he addresses some of what their versatility is in the same way, certainly, that, you're hoping that Isaiah Jackson would, or that Enrique Freeman might at some point if he was playing really small ball 5. So I think it's fine as a flyer. I think it's a lot more likely that the Pacers will help him necessarily than defensively that he's going to help them. But, maybe the change of surroundings. And like I said, going from, he's been in 2 wildly different situations. He played with Golden State where he was on a contender, where he's playing in a very read-based offense in a different way, different types of reads, not very much pick and roll with the Golden State Warriors, playing a lot of pick and roll with the Detroit Pistons with lineups where, it's vets who aren't going to be on the roster anymore. It's very young guys, not a very competent offense being run up there last year either, especially in terms of spacing concerns, where he's now coming to a Pacer team that runs a lot of pick and roll with 3 very high-level pick and roll creators. I think that there's room to think that he'll take steps forward. I'm not sure that it necessarily addresses the needs that they have, and that's kind of, I understand doing it. They needed to fill the 3rd string role, and if he, as a former number 2 overall pick, ends up being able to do that and progresses with them, they've had, their pro scouting department's been very good. They've found a lot of players for the Pacers who have come here out of bad situations and been able to flourish in different ways. So I think it's possible that happens, but I haven't really seen with the defensive versatility that really adding up for James Wiseman to this point in his career.
My last question for you is TJ McConnell put together a magical season where everybody fell in love with him. I mean, got the respect around the league. Pacer Nation was, rejuvenated, saying we got to sign this guy long term. Do you think a McConnell extension happens this offseason, or is this something the Pacers should be a little bit patient on, waiting, given a little bit of, the logjam at the guard spots and just his age, things like that?
It's going to sound like a cop-out, but I'd probably be okay either way. If they extended him, I'd be like, oh, yeah, okay. Like, TJ definitely was an important piece last year. TJ leads the entire NBA in drives per 100 possessions. That's right, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, you're second to TJ. And that's a definite skill, especially given that he's not a three-point threat. His ability to turn the corner, I think, is probably unmatched if you were to look at it out of pistol action. So, like I said, the Pacers have been very good at running a double point guard offense. I think that they're capable of doing that. But we know what Andrew can do out of ball screens, and if he's out there on the floor, it's going to be more likely that his usage will take a step back with Tyrese, and that his usage would also take a step back from TJ, because TJ is just not as an effective as an off-ball player as Tyrese or Andrew. So that's what that situation is. So if the Pacers kind of want, or if Andrew and they have talked and they want to optimize him more as a ball handler, that's something that Andrew wants in the long term. Maybe you think about it a little bit, but I think that they're in a pretty luxury position right now where, from the Pacers' perspective, they have those guys under contract. They know that it can work. They know that it can work in Rick's offense, and you kind of go with it from there. Because, like what I keep telling everybody, you guys mentioned before that Ben and Andrew doesn't need to be Sabonis, Miles Turner situation. Andrew and Tyrese doesn't need to be either. Like this is very different from that. These are two players that complement each other. These are two players where it's not the same purgatory there. If you get to a place where you need to have a real conversation about whether Andrew needs to be siphoning possessions in the ball from Tyrese, like, I think that you're in a really good spot right there if that's something that's a question that you're asking. So that's kind of where I land with all 3-point guards. Like, if I got told that TJ got signed to an extension, I would think that they're pretty confident in how they're going to manage all those things, and that they're fairly confident that that's something that Andrew's on board with. And if they don't, then I think it's fine to play it by ear as well.
Yeah, and especially with the new, aprons and the salary, it all just seems very tricky right now, especially if you throw in what they might pay Turner next offseason. I think that they kind of have to be very careful right now with how they figure things out, and that to me is why they also could do a consolidation trade, is to try to maybe save some money in the offseason next year. So it's going to be interesting. Caitlin, it's been a lot of fun having you back on. I know we usually do some type of draft when you're on, and I said, don't worry about a draft today, but I will put you on the spot because you're always finding new creative foods to try and things like that. So is there anything that maybe you've tried over the summer that you'd like to share with our listeners?
I will out my sister who wishes to remain anonymous. So in my last mailbag, we remade a popsicle that we had made during the World Cup last year. We were trying to outdo Bomb Pops. We made red, white, and blue pops. We challenged each other to a popsicle cook-off. Hers was much better than mine, which I don't think should surprise anybody. So I was like, let's make those again. We'll have like a company picnic. We'll take a picture. We'll put it in the mailbag. So she remakes them. Spends the day doing this. I helped her, but she was the main person in charge. Let's put it that way. These get done. They're frozen. We take them out. I do not know what went wrong with these, but you know how much I love popsicles. Didn't finish it. Didn't finish it. Something was wrong. Like, it was coconut milk, strawberries, and blueberries. And I'm telling you, the first bite of it, it tasted like corn. We in Indiana know what corn tastes like. It tasted like corn. She agreed. I was like, because we didn't at first say what it tasted like. We were just both like, this is not good. And she's like, I don't know what went wrong with this. And then like an hour later, I was like, it kind of tasted like corn. She's like, that's what I thought too. So I don't know if the coconut milk was like expired, what exactly the deal was here, but it was a low point.
Man,
I've really only had, I think, maybe 2 popsicles that I just flat out didn't like. And that was one of them. And the original recipe was quite good. That's why I don't know what went wrong, but something went awry in the production.
I feel like a corn popsicle would not be the worst Indiana thing ever.
I'm surprised there aren't corn pops.
Yeah, like at the state fair, like we don't have a booth for the corn popsicles. I mean, that'd be interesting. Facci, what are your thoughts on popsicles? You a popsicle guy? Are you still having? Are you more of an ice cream guy?
I had ice cream last night. I did. So to be honest, sounds like a cop out. Sometimes a popsicle a little too cold for my teeth, But I had some good ice cream. It was a chocolate and vanilla swirl, cookie dough. Very good. My wife loves ice cream, so there was no getting out of that last night, but I enjoyed it. What about you, Alex? Popsicle or soft?
I mean, I know Caitlin's got. I think are you dairy? You can't have dairy. That's right, Caitlin.
I have a sensitivity, yes.
Okay, I thought that was
My
what we
wife's gluten
established.
free. That's her thing. I guess this probably doesn't even pertain in this situation at all.
Yeah.
But, while we're talking about what we
Hey,
can,
I'll just say this: I'm trying to cut back on my dairy because I do realize how much better I feel when I don't have as much dairy. So I will say this: when we went grocery shopping today, or I should say Sunday afternoon, we went grocery shopping. I'm trying to cut back on my sugar as well. So I did buy some no sugar Outshine popsicles today. I don't know if because I knew Caitlin was coming on the podcast, it was in my mind that I wanted these or not. I mean,
was it the dark cherry flavoring?
It was the box that has like the multi flavor. So I'm not sure. Like orange maybe. I can't remember, but I was like, this will give me some variety. I'm trying to cut back on my ice cream. I really haven't had a lot recently. I did have Dairy Queen the other night. I mean, and I don't really know if that counts as ice cream or not, but it's cold and it tastes like ice cream, right? So
I'm really not having ice cream and I'm really not having dairy, but I went to Dairy Queen.
I don't count Dairy Queen. It's like, what else would they be known for? That's
yeah.
ice cream to me.
But I am cutting back on my sugar starting on Monday this week. You guys probably listen to this like Tuesday or Wednesday. So anyway, not to bore you guys with what I'm going to be eating, but I'm just trying to cut back on my sugar, things like that, and just try to eat a little bit healthier. Because
I think the more important question is, have you been to Nicey Tree yet?
I haven't been. I gotta write that down. I'm gonna write it down here, Caitlin, just so I don't forget on my little notepad that I have because we talk about it and I always want to go, and then I never think about it.
I've been there. Again? It's at the Fishers District.
Fishers, okay.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll.
They have one in Broad Ripple too. They have one in Broad Ripple too, but I don't know. They were moving locations there, but I've been to both of them.
I'll have to see if I can get Kristen Airy or JJ to meet me up there, and we'll get some.
JJ went. JJ went.
He did. That's right. You're right. He did. I'll have to get Kristen because I don't think he's God. And I'll see if me and CD can go up there, and then maybe I can figure out what's going on with Bally Sports while we're up there. So, but no, Caitlin, I appreciate it so much. I was going to do a start, sit, cut with you as well, but I don't want to put you on the spot with giving you former Pacer players for that. So we'll save that for another day.
Bless you.
Anything you want to plug for your Patreon before we let you go?
Actually, I do. So if you go to X, my Twitter handle at C2_Cooper, the Patreon links there, patreon.com/basketballshewrote. So for this month, I had a lot of mailbag questions in July, and I get asked very detailed mailbag questions. And I did the entire July one just about Ben and Jarace because there was a ton of questions about that. And I decided to hold some of them over to August. So those were requiring like quite a bit of extensive research. So there's going to be 2 pieces coming out. Both of them deal with the chemistry between Pascal Siakam and Miles Turner, but in different ways and at both ends of the floor. So those pieces are going to be coming out soon. So that's something that people can keep an eye on because like another fun Pacer related number, the most efficient action in the playoffs for the entire NBA was a Pascal Siakam post up. And I will leave you with that. That's a teaser for what's coming in the article.
Wow. Well, sounds like everybody's got to check that out. I don't think anybody breaks down Pacer basketball better than Caitlin. So, Caitlin, thank you very much for coming back on. It had been too long, as I said earlier, and we can't wait to having you back.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys. Fun to do something off-season that isn't so off-season in the middle of August.
All right, Caitlin. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.
See ya.